Hello and welcome to UK Column Live. I'm Brian Gerrish and I'm joined in the studio today by Wilfred Wong, who's a long-term 22-year child abuse campaigner. And Wilfred, you're also a trained barrister, but you're not practicing as a barrister.
Yes.
Okay. Well, our subject today is SRA, Satanic Ritual Abuse, and in particular we're coming into this very dark subject from the angle of the abuse of children. So I'm just going to pop up on screen a warning. We do not think that this interview is suitable for children. And we would also say to people that have been affected by SRA, be careful about whether you decide to stay with us as we talk through some of the issues. So this is a particularly dark subject. We think it's one that needs talking about. But we do want to warn people that we are going to be talking some fairly graphic things. Now, we did an earlier interview with Wilfred Wong, which is available on the UK Column website. If you'd like to see it, all you need to do is put Wilfred Wong into the search box on the UK Column website, and that previous interview will come up. I'm just going to bring on screen one of the images we used from that original interview. And this was the BBC reporting that the Royal Navy in Britain had decided to make Satanism an approved religious ideology for use on board warships. And the reason we showed this image was to say in one simple image, we don't have to prove Satanism exists because it's already been approved by the British government. It was quite remarkable, Wilfred, that the government simply introduced Satanism on board warship.
Yes, it's official recognition and acceptance that Satanism exists in the UK, enough to warrant its official recognition on warships. And yet, there's a double standard here because the British government has yet to officially recognize that Satanist ritual abuse occurs in the UK. Yeah. They can't have it both ways. And they should stop acting as if it's not a real phenomenon. And at the same time, we need to question the government on this. What prompted them to recognize Satanism for the Royal Navy? I understand that they are considering giving recognition for the other armed services as well in Britain.
Right. Well, what a state of affairs, and I think many people would be very surprised to learn this, but there we are, reported by the BBC, absolute fact that the Royal Navy has simply said, welcome on board Satanists, you're very happy to practice your rituals. Well, in the first interview, we ran through quite a number of topics in order to give our audience evidence as to what satanic ritual abuse was about. We talked about the Jeffrey Dickens case and evidence that was put forward. We talked about Jimmy Savile. We talked about the abuse of the Scottish girl Holly Gregg. And you mentioned also a particular charity, Izzy's Promise, which is based up in Scotland, which is doing some really good work to assist child abuse survivors from SRA. We talked about the Truro witches and some of the other convictions. There was the South Wales case where the police had been able to secure a conviction. And what we were really trying to put across to our audience was the evidence is there to be seen, to be found, that satanic ritual abuse is not just a fiction. The evidence is there to say that it's very real. It is going on and it's deeply unpleasant. And what we thought we were trying to achieve today was to have a little bit of a looser discussion about SRA, to take a look about the attributes of it, the history, the numbers of people who may be involved, why the government reacts as it does, which is usually a wall of silence, why the police very often refuse to do their job, and ultimately to say, if you are as concerned with this subject as we are, what you can do to help stop it and prevent it. So I think one of the key things, Wilfred, is people say, we've seen the evidence that Satanism is real. We've got it approved in the armed forces. And you are saying that many children, thousands of children, are hurt and abused, and indeed some of them are murdered in satanic ritual ceremonies. Where is the evidence for thousands of children being involved in it? How would you say to people, or how would you present to people that this is not one or two isolated incidents over a very long period of time? What we're talking about is a lot of children.
Yes, because over the last 3 or 4 decades, we have seen thousands of people coming forward with testimonies of having suffered SRA, seeking help, seeking counseling, seeking therapy. We have also seen thousands of people coming forward who suffer from DID, dissociative identity disorder, which used to be commonly known as multiple personality disorder.
Right.
And if you speak to veterans who have counseled and given therapy to DID survivors, they will normally tell you that the majority of DID patients they've come across have suffered SRA, or say they have suffered SRA. And so these thousands over the last couple of decades shows you some indication of the extent of the problem, which is not surprising given that the authorities have failed to act on SRA for so long and continue to fail to act on this subject. So the problem just grows. It's like a cancer that's not treated. It just keeps spreading and getting worse.
Right.
And just an analogy you can draw with the abuse in Rotherham, which was not SRA, but by Asian gangs of non-Asian children in Rotherham alone, for a much lesser period than the couple of decades we've seen SRA at the extent that it is today. There they had at least 1,400 children who were abused in one location. I know for a fact that SRA is happening across the UK, not just one town, as in the Rotherham case. And so it has to be thousands, and that is shown by the thousands of people coming forward seeking help. And as I said in the previous program, no matter how much we try to ignore SRA, or society tries to ignore it, the victims keep coming forward with testimonies about having suffered this kind of abuse, which are very similar to that of other victims who they never met before. You know,
right.
It's
so
not
independent victims never met each other, come from different locations.
with the same characteristics of SRA that others have identified. They are coming forward.
Right.
And the interesting thing is many of the SRA survivors I've met have not read any of the books about SRA that we have read. So you can't say that they've been influenced by those books. They've experienced it firsthand and come forward and talked about what they experienced, which fits very much the description about SRA that you find in books like Tim Tate's Children for the Devil. So this is going to continue. The flood of victims coming forward is going to continue and get even worse unless the authorities start to effectively deal with SRA.
Right. So this is a key point here, that in practical terms, these victims are coming forward, you're dealing with them, therapists are dealing with them. Indeed, some of the child help agencies and charities are encountering these people. Kids Company, I'm specifically going to mention, was starting to come into contact with this type of abuse, but nobody talks about it. So we're going to discuss that issue. But on the subject, is this a new phenomena? When can we say this satanic ritual abuse began? Are we talking 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago? What's the history?
I think SRA, as we see it now, or in the last few decades, has reached an unprecedented growth in the UK. But there has been a degree of SRA in the UK, probably at a much lower level for a long period of time. But it intensified, my estimate is from the 1970s onwards, it intensified in growth and has spread.
And what would be the cause for that? Why do you say it was going on, but in 1970 something acted as a catalyst for it?
I think one of the key catalysts for the growth of SRA was the social revolution that took place in the 1960s, in the late 60s, on issues like sexual morals, And that created the kind of society where SRA was able to flourish more easily and attract more recruits, because the conventional restraints that people had were dropped. And it's interesting to note that Aleister Crowley, the leading British Satanist, said that the law of Satanists is to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of attitude that was strongly propagated in the 1960s. Do whatever gives you pleasure. Do whatever you want. And I think that contributed to the growth of recruits into Satanism and SRA in the UK, and it's been growing ever since. Plus the fact that since the late 60s, there has been a retreat from the Christian heritage of the UK.
Right.
And that has left a vacuum which has been filled not just by secularism or other religions, but also by Satanism.
Right.
And so this has contributed to the growth of Satanism and of SRA, although I would point out that not all Satanists are necessarily engaged in SRA, but many are.
Right. Now, Tim Tate, in his book, which we can just have a look at the cover of that, Children for the Devil. I've read that book. It's a very heavy read, but it really starts to make you think. You've got a copy sitting in front of you. He gives a bit of history, and he's going back to Satanism in 18th century England, talking about, in particular, wealthy people running the Hellfire clubs and indulging in what I think he describes as orgiastic sex, but into those sexual rituals were introduced children. So there's a pattern for it there, but you're specifically saying that you believe that the social revolution in the 60s, free love, a moving away from a tighter moral straitjacket, enabled this stuff to start flourishing in a way that it hadn't done before.
Yes, I think we've seen unprecedented growth in Satanism and SRA in the UK, at least since the late 60s. But as Tim Tate points out in his book, the history of Satanism in the UK goes back to at least the 18th century, if not further. And it's very interesting to note that as far back as the 18th century, a lot of members of the establishment and of the aristocracy were getting involved in Satanism, and that children were present at many of these rituals. And they were not there just as observers. These children were there, as they are today, at these rituals as victims.
Right.
And so you could say that based on what Tim Tate researched and wrote about, that SRA goes back as far as the 18th century in Britain. But what I'm saying is that the degree and extent of SRA has been unprecedentedly high from at least the 1970s onwards, and it's growing. It continues to grow because the authorities still pretend it doesn't exist.
Right. Okay, now we've touched on this before, but what is actually being done with the children when they are drawn into these cults or used as a victim within a satanic ritual abuse environment?
Well, they're abused in these rituals, and it's very important to note that Satanism is the only religion in the world today that openly encourages sexual abuse of children and human sacrifice. Not all Satanists do this, but it does openly encourage this.
Right.
And Aleister Crowley, for example, the leading British Satanist in the early 20th century, who's still a leading figure in international Satanism and in British Satanism, openly encouraged the sacrifice of a child in his book entitled Magic.
We can actually bring that up on screen. We'll just show you. This is part of the text. It may be a little bit difficult to see there, but here it says a male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. And then on page 96, it goes on to say, but the bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious. And for nearly all purposes, human sacrifice is the best. Now, we can say this man was mad. We can say lots of things about him. but he had an intellect which enabled him to write in a book very coldly and clinically that if you were going to get into deep satanic magic, then you were going to be involved in sacrifice, of which he is saying a male child is the perfect victim. So this is, it's in your face as to what this element of Satanism is about. But you've said there that not all Satanists are engaged in this sort of, in ritual abuse.
No, many are, but not all. So we shouldn't assume just because a person is a Satanist that automatically it means they're engaged in SRA.
Right.
But I'm saying that the ideology, the belief system, encourages this as part of the rituals. So it's one thing to say that there are child abusers in every religious group, which is true. But you need to understand the difference, that none of those religious groups, except Satanism, actively promotes child abuse or child sacrifice.
Right. So does that make a Satanist involved in this? Does that make them a paedophile, or are they something different?
I think they could be a paedophile, but in many cases they are not paedophiles. They are doing what they believe their religion encourages them to do, which is to abuse that child, usually as part of a ritual. And so they don't have a strong sexual orientation towards children, but they're just doing what they feel is their duty to their religion or what they owe to their religion. But of course, the child still suffers no matter what, regardless of the motivation that the Satanist may have.
Yeah.
Of course, there are also pedophiles involved. But that's another reason why I say do not equate child sexual abuse with SRA. They are two quite different things. SRA does involve child sexual abuse, but there's a lot more to it than that. And a pedophile is not, an SRA abuser is not necessarily a pedophile. They can be someone who is not a pedophile, but is abusing children as part of what he sees as his religious duty.
Right. And we've got another element to this, which is mentioned in one of the books. We will bring it up on screen in a minute, but it's effectively saying that the Satanist wants to change society, whereas the bulk of the paedophiles want to be able to do what they do, and the world goes on around them. The difference with the Satanist is that they actually want to change the world to work in the way they believe it should. Is that correct?
Yes. That was pointed out in a book entitled Chasing Satan by Diane Corr, who was one of the earliest people in Britain to speak out against SRA publicly.
Right.
And I think that's a very important statement that she made, because the Satanists are not only focused on abusing children and also turning them into abusers and into future Satanists, but also want to transform society to adopt Satanist values.
Right.
Now, this is a warning to all of us. Don't think if you ignore SRA, it's not going to come for you, because they want to transform all of society, which is going to impact all of us. And taking on their values is not going to be a pretty sight. It's going to be something very dark and very harmful for all of us if we don't do something to stop SRA.
Right.
On top of that, I would add that the Satanists also are always looking for more victims, child victims, and looking for ways to access more children. So nobody's child is really safe if you ignore this issue.
Right.
We have to face up to it and deal with it. Otherwise, it's going to ruin our society. And bear in mind that it really undermines the rule of law, that there is one special law, apparently, letting the Satanists off their crimes, but everybody else is held to the law. Right. If you see what I mean, that as long as SRA is being ignored by the authorities, Satanist ritual abusers can abuse with impunity. That severely undermines the rule of law and the democracy that we're supposed to be living in.
Okay, so we've got a group of people that you're saying are going to work as hard as they can to be able to change society. That to me suggests that they're going to be very, very keen to infiltrate seats of power. They're going to want to be in politics. They're going to want to be in any organisation which is lobbying or working to change society. So we're looking at somebody who is perhaps power hungry. What are the characteristics of these people got? I mean, can we recognise a Satanist walking along the road? How do we know who is a Satanist?
I think Satanists can look like anybody else. I think it's important to note that they are not going to go around looking like what you think Hollywood might cast a Satanist as. It's not so obvious, and they're not so careless as to make it so obvious. In fact, I've seen pictures of some Satanists, some of whom, yes, look quite sinister, and others who look very innocent, really, and look quite amiable and respectable. There is no particular look or appearance of a Satanist. And I suppose you could say about the same regarding pedophiles. And it's a mistake to think that they have to fit a certain look. But there are certain common personality traits, I would say, of Satanist ritual abusers. One of which is a complete lack of empathy for others, and a complete lack of empathy for the people whom they abuse or victimize or sacrifice. It's like they treat these people as objects. They don't care about their humanity.
Right. Could we say that, would it be fair to say they're psychopaths? Is that the right description?
No, I wouldn't say they're psychopaths. In fact, they are well in possession of their mental faculties, and many of them are probably of quite above intelligence. But I would say they're sociopaths in that they do not have empathy for others. Like serial killers, they lack the empathy for others. And in a way, you could say that some Satanists are serial killers because they carry out ritual sacrifices time and time again. And they just continue to kill people in these sacrifices, and serial rapists. I don't think that's an inaccurate description of them. What is disturbing, of course, is that they are left free to serially kill others and serially rape children because the authorities and the media fail to acknowledge this problem and deal with it.
Right. One of the points that you made earlier was that, of course, these people can be the product themselves of a satanic upbringing. So it's intergenerational, and you've got people who we would consider are damaged. We can call them a sociopath, but they're very cold, they're low empathy, they're prepared to do horrible things, but they're only in that condition because they were brought up and abused themselves, which has caused the DID, as you've called it. Would you say that the intergenerational aspect is the most important? That we are faced with, how do we describe it, a clique of families, or is it much broader than that? People are being drawn into it.
I would point out that, yes, intergenerational Satanism is very common, but not all their victims are from within their families. They can get victims from outside their families. For example, we know that Satanists are involved in other kinds of criminal activity, such as human trafficking, and that could be a source for some of their victims. We also know that sometimes they go after people who have no family around them to care for them, right, such as homeless people, for example. Right. And so the circle of victims is very wide that Satanists target who are ritual abusers. But yes, they do cultivate their victims, if they are children, to become Satanist abusers themselves when they grow older. That's why they encourage children to abuse other children. So one of the telltale signs of SRA is when you see a case where the child is being pressured to abuse another child, which is not what your average pedophile does, but is what Satanist ritual abusers do. And they want to corrupt the child emotionally, spiritually, mentally. They want to corrupt the child. So they're destroying the child on many different levels, not only physically, sexually abusing it, but also corrupting the child on a very deep level to turn the child into a person who's as vicious as them when their child grows older. Now, some children, fortunately, as they get older, they manage to get out of these covens, but some stay on and in turn become abusers. So, for example, I know that in the Holly case, it is strongly suspected that one of the alleged abusers was himself a victim of the coven when he was a child.
Yes. Right, so we've got this happening to thousands of children. Abuse survivors are coming forward and talking to people. The information is there. We know that some of the survivors are talking to politicians. Why is none of this coming out into the media? Why is it not being reported? It's horrific. You would imagine that everybody feels emotion for the protection of children. We do hear about child abuse, but we hear almost nothing about satanic ritual abuse. Why do you think that is?
I think part of the problem is that the media is one of the influential sectors in society which the Satanist ritual abusers have targeted for infiltration and influence. I know of some particular journalists who have been named by SRA survivors as being Satanist ritual abusers.
Right.
But I also know that there are other journalists who are not involved with SRA but know about SRA, but for all the wrong reasons do not want to cover the issue. Fear, simply following the herd, for example. Peer pressure, intimidation. All these kind of factors play a part in their failure to speak out. They have a duty to speak out, but they're not doing so. Only a few newspapers have the courage to speak out about SRA, such as the Sunday Express and the Sunday People. Unfortunately, a lot of the media are too easily intimidated, too easily cowed into silence in this country. It's not as aggressive or outspoken as, say, the US media is. Hopefully it will change. We continue to try and get media interest in these issues. The problem is the lack of boldness you have in the UK media. Of course, those who are secretly working for the Satanists, we're not going to bother trying to change them. We know what their agenda is. But, you know, there are more than enough other journalists who can speak out, but for their own reasons, such as fear, choose not to. And we need to encourage them to speak out. But they're not the only ones who need to speak out. A lot of people who know about SRA, whether it's in the church or in other parts of society, who can speak out, choose not to. And that's a problem across the board. Because of this lack of courage, to put it bluntly, this kind of horrific abuse is able to flourish and grow.
Right.
And it's time to be bold. It's time to speak out. It's time to recognize that our freedom is also at stake here. Because the Satanists want to transform society. And they also are undermining the rule of law, which is going to undermine our freedom. Once you have a special law for a certain group and everybody else has another law, that is a recipe for the loss of freedom.
Now, you mentioned earlier, I think it might have been one of your first cases, but as a survivor coming forward talking about SRA and saying that they tried to get the police to act, but they didn't. So is this a common theme from the survivors, that when they go to the authorities, they can't actually get a normal response from the police or from local officials?
Yeah, in one of the early cases I dealt with on SRA, the mother of an SRA victim, who was a young child, reported what she knew to the police. And the police not only refused to help her, one of the police officers even threatened her to back off. And the range of police unhelpfulness ranges from indifference to sometimes threats to, in some extreme cases, actual participation in SRA. I've had some cases where the police were reported to actually participate in some of the Satanist ritual abuse. We know that the Satanists have also targeted the police for influence for obvious reasons, because they want to be above the law. And unfortunately, this is also accelerated, I think, this problem by the extensive participation of many of our police officers in Freemasonry. Freemasonry is not, I'm not saying that Freemasonry is a Satanist group as such, but I am saying that Satanists have managed to infiltrate Freemasonry and use it to support many of their own Satanist objectives, including covering up SRA.
Right.
And the secretive nature of Freemasonry has made it easier for them to do this. I'm sure that most Freemasons have no idea about this and are just thinking it's a social club. But unfortunately, the Satanists who have a hidden agenda have managed to infiltrate into the ranks of Freemasonry and network with people like police officers, judges, and that helps to cover their tracks when they are being exposed for abuse.
Right.
And this is part of what Diane Kaur, I believe, was referring to about Satanists trying to transform society. They don't do it in an open way. If they want to do it in an open way, they're entitled to do that in a democracy. But as Diane pointed out, they do it secretively.
Let's see whether I can just bring that quote up, because it is quite a powerful quote. We should be able to bring that up on screen. I'll read it out so we've got listeners here. So the book is Chasing Satan by Diane Kaur, and she says there is also unique cultural dimension. There is also a unique cultural dimension to satanic crime. The perpetrators want to change society, whereas the paedophile is interested only in satisfying his lusts and otherwise wishes the world to continue as it is. The Satanist wants to undermine the institutions and morality of society. In a democracy, they're entitled to pursue such goals so long as they have the guts to openly declare their objectives. But they are cowards who lurk in dark corners, determined to engineer their objectives secretly. This is the danger, isn't it? These people work in the shadows. They don't want to openly declare what they're doing. They work around in the background to change things. Now, what about MPs? Police, well, you've said that a Satanist can be any area of society. Victims come forward, gone to the police for help, they're not helping. What about MPs? What sort of reaction are we getting to MPs who are told about this?
Well, I've known of some parliamentarians who were specifically named by SRA survivors as being engaged in SRA themselves. But on the whole, my experience with British parliamentarians has been that they are quite open to accepting that SRA is a problem in Britain, partly because many MPs have been approached by their own constituents with SRA cases.
Right.
Don't underestimate the importance of lobbying your local MP about SRA and being very open with them about SRA. I advised one SRA survivor to do this with her local MP, and not only did the local MP help her, but he also said that he'd been approached about SRA cases before by another SRA survivor. So there's a lot to be said in getting the support of local MPs to speak out about SRA. And because they have their ears close to the ground with their constituents, and for many SRA survivors, at some point they go to their local MP for help.
Right.
And the MPs can, in some cases, be quite helpful, and especially now that there's heightened public awareness about abuse cover-ups.
Right. Let's be, excuse the phrase, but we'll be the devil's advocate here. If we've got an MP, he's a sympathetic or she's a sympathetic person, the victim comes forward. What are the MPs going to be able to do if we're already discussing that some of the police are involved in this? Where can an MP go that an ordinary member of the public couldn't go to achieve some sort of follow-up on the crime?
Well, I think an MP is listened to a lot more than an individual member of the public by people such as the Chief Constable of the local police force. And a lot of lobbying sometimes has to be targeted at the chief constable if his police force is unwilling or indifferent towards investigating an SRA case. And so it's much more powerful if the MP writes to the chief constable than if the private individual does it. The vast majority of police, I believe, are not involved in SRA, although some of them may be influenced by people involved in SRA. And I think there are still many sincere police officers in our society. It's just a case of sometimes having to pressure their leaders to get things going.
Right.
That's why the chief constable is often a useful person to lobby, but you've got a lot more clout if you've got the local MP on your side. And even if you don't have the local MP on your side, if you've got some British parliamentarian on your side, that helps a lot.
Right. And of course, to be fair to our MPs, which we should try and be to some extent, is that when they can see that they're getting support from the public, that gives them strength, doesn't it? That encourages them to do things.
Yes.
And as we're seeing over the child abuse issue at the moment, we've gone from just a couple of MPs speaking out. So we've got Simon Danzuk and we've got Tom Watson and John Mann. Now there's a little group. There's some strength in that group. So I would take your point that these MPs, once they start working, can produce more than just the ordinary person on the street can.
I think it's a partnership because the MPs don't have the resources to do the research into these issues or to interview the SRA survivors. Usually the first port of call, so to speak, is either some children's welfare organization or some child protection campaigner, and that person would do the research, do the interviews with the SRA survivor, and then help that person to go and see the local MP. And so it's a partnership where you provide the information to the local MP and the advice and the suggestions, and even sometimes draft the letters for them, and they take up the action with, for example, the chief constable, or if necessary with social services, and basically front the campaign.
Yeah.
And this is very helpful, this partnership, and it's more effective than if you just go it alone without any parliamentarian support.
Okay. Wilfred, I know you're really keen to be talking about what people can do about this, and we will come on to that. But probably an important thing for us to say to the audience at the moment is that the government hasn't got any leeway over this subject, because if we look at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's very, very specific in saying that governments have got to deal with this. So we can just bring that up on screen. This is here Article 34, which is the one that is the powerful one. States parties undertake to protect the child from all forms of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. For these purposes, states parties shall in particular take all appropriate national, bilateral and multilateral measures to prevent the inducement or coercion of a child to engage in any unlawful sexual activity, the exploitative use of children in prostitution or other unlawful sexual practices, the exploitative use of children in pornographic performances and materials. And then underneath that article, as by way of explanation, it actually says that this includes ritualistic abuse. So, excuse me, so there's no ifs or buts here. The government is supposed to deal with this.
Yes, Article 34 plainly states that the government undertakes to protect the child from all forms of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse.
Right.
And I would add that child pornography is something which is often produced by those who are engaged in Satanist ritual abuse. They often film their victims being abused to make child pornography. So it's important to realize that the British government is failing to fulfill its international legal obligation under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the British government has ratified. and is therefore subject to. And yet, no one has really brought them to make them accountable for this failure to adhere to Article 34. We need to internationalize this subject of SRA if we want to increase the pressure on the British authorities to act. Because the problem is that, as we have earlier discussed, the level of support that people in influential positions give to each other within Britain is such that sometimes there's a lot of back scratching going on to cover up SRA. So it's helpful to internationalize it and bring in international comment and concern, for example, from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, to ask the British government, what are you doing to adhere to Article 34 in relation to Satanist ritual abuse?
A very simple, powerful question, because they can't dodge it.
Yes. In fact, I used to lobby at the UN Human Rights Commission, as it then was, in Geneva. Now it's called the UN Human Rights Council. And I personally saw some documents produced by the UN Human Rights Commission which mentioned SRA in Britain not being dealt with as it should have been.
Right.
Apparently, complaints had been made to them about the failure of the British authorities to deal with SRA. So that was very good. That was very encouraging. I could see that some attempts have been made to internationalize the issue. And I think we should. I believe in a two-way street on human rights. Yes, the British government can complain, for example, about China's human rights record. I think that's good. That's the only form of accountability we have on human rights. But at the same time, I'd like to see China and maybe Russia pointing a finger at the British government and saying, what are you doing to protect your children from Satanist ritual abuse? And the only way we're going to achieve that is if we get the issue of SRA into international forums, including the United Nations.
Right, and the only way we're going to do that is by talking about it, which is where we've started.
Talking about it and publicly acknowledging we're talking about SRA. We're not talking about ordinary child abuse. We're talking about SRA because that's the big issue being covered up. And that's the big issue that's been swept under the carpet for so long.
Right. Well, we're going to say to people that we're getting on to the point where we are really saying that why are we making this program today? We're making it to try and get people to understand how bad SRA is and the fact that there needs to be action to stop it. How can you do that? Well, of course, the first thing is that you've got to start to equip yourself with the knowledge to understand what it's about. So we just bring back on screen, we've got 3 books that we're just going to point people to. This one, Tim Tate, Children for the Devil. The subject matter is extremely heavy. Some of it is very unpleasant, but the book is very easy and straightforward to read. There's a lot of factual information. There's talk about investigations that have taken place in the country. There are very many statements from abuse survivors talking about what they went through, what they experienced. And of course, it is also talking about dealing with child witnesses and what their testimony is about what they endured. So this book covers everything. It talks about the subject, it talks about victims, and it also gives statistical information about the number of cases and where they're spread across the country. You also have pointed us to this one. I apologise about the quality of that image. It was the best I could get, but the book is Blasphemous Rumours, and this is by Andrew Boyd. Can you tell us a little bit about this one?
This is a comprehensive book on Satanist ritual abuse in Britain. And like Tim Tate's book, it also refers to the fact that Satanism and SRA has existed in Britain a lot longer than most people realize. And Satanism has been a phenomenon in Europe as a whole for a lot longer than most people realize. So we're not talking about some new phenomenon exported here from the United States, right, as some of the skeptics try to claim. Because we're talking about something that has been around for a very long time, but has seen unprecedented growth in the last couple of decades.
Right. Okay, and we'll bring the other one up on screen. We've just shown this, but this is Diane Corr's book. Now, I'm going to admit I haven't read this one, so What can you tell us about this one? And I believe that you know this lady personally, so you've got experience of
Yes,
this
I
work.
do. She's a very courageous woman who spoke out against SRA in the 1980s and 1990s. And she has spoken out very clearly about SRA, which I hope more people will do, calling SRA SRA, not child abuse or anything else, but Satanist ritual abuse, which is the right name for it. And unfortunately, since that time, things have been watered down. In the time when she was speaking out in the early 90s and during the 1980s, people referred to it as SRA, Satanist ritual abuse. But there has been a steadily diluting of the phrase. For example, taking away the word Satanist and then just saying ritual abuse, which begs the question of who's doing the ritual abuse. And the fact is that ritual abuse as a term came up in the context of Satanist ritual abuse. So we should stick to that and not try and confuse the issue by making it more broad and vague, by calling it ritual abuse. Although that's better than nothing, it's better than calling it child sex abuse.
Yeah.
But we should get back, I think, to that time when SRA was SRA, and we just called it SRA, as Diane called it. And her book is a very good summary of the issue. It's not as big as Tim Tate's or Andrew Boyd's book, but it's a very easy and readable introduction to the issue. And of course, she has a lot of personal experience dealing with the issue. So that adds a lot of credibility to what she writes. And unlike the other two books, she very clearly pointed out the desire of the Satanists to transform our society.
Yeah. Now, what do we say to people who are interested in the subject, but they're thinking this is not a nice subject and I'm not sure I want to go there? What do you say to those people that are feeling a little bit scared about this subject and whether they should be doing anything?
Well, I think we need to remember, as I said earlier, this is going to affect all of us in the medium to long term, and our children, if we have children, or our grandchildren. If we care about our society and the children in our society and the freedom that we enjoy in our society, we need to start dealing with SRA now. It's going to come back at us sooner or later if we just keep ignoring it. Yes, it's a dark issue, but it's the dark issues which need the light the most. You don't shine a light in a bright room. That's redundant.
That's true.
You shine a light in a dark place where it needs light. So when people say it's a dark issue, I say all the more reason why you need to shine a light into it. And to bring a light into it, and if more people bring light into that dark issue, then we'll have a lot of light on this dark issue.
Right. So supposing we've got somebody watching this interview and they say, actually, I'd like to help. So they're in a county, they're in Staffordshire. How do they start to get involved? How would they know what is going on in Staffordshire in a satanic sense? What would you expect them to do or not do, maybe?
Well, I think there are two things people can do, and I would suggest people thinking about getting together with like-minded people who are concerned about uninvestigated child abuse cases, SRA, and to together campaign on the issue and research the issue. Campaigning and research, these two things can be done, and they feed each other. You're a more effective campaigner if you also research the issues, because then you've got the information at your fingertips and you're more able to persuade people like your local MP to take on the issue. Right. And I think one way, of course, of researching the issue is to pay close attention to what the media is reporting about child abuse in your area. Look out for characteristics of SRA in case, as in many cases, the media don't mention the SRA in the case. We covered the common characteristics of SRA in our first interview, and if viewers haven't seen that, I encourage them to see that program and look out for those characteristics. For example, children being pressured to abuse other children. That is one of the common characteristics of SRA. And you don't normally see that in an ordinary child abuse case. And pick these up from whatever the media has reported on child abuse cases in your area. The other thing that you can do is, if you think there is somebody who knows about an SRA case in the area and could be a credible witness who can share information about it, go and interview them, try and get information from them. But you always got to make a judgment about how credible they may be and how sincere they may be in wanting to share information with you. I think we also need to understand the local knowledge. Some areas pick up a lot of negative reputation, so to speak, because they have been associated with Satanist ritual abuse. For example, only recently I went to visit a SRA location that has been notorious for SRA, witchcraft, and so on for decades. And so I went to look at it myself. And of course, the locals would know about it. It's local knowledge. In fact, it's more than local knowledge. It's been such a notorious location that even people from outside the county know about it.
Right.
And sometimes you get places like that, and usually there is some story behind it. There is some activity of a particular Satanist coven that has given rise to this reputation. It's interesting to point out that the Sunday Express article you ran in our first interview about Jimmy Savile going to Whitby to do satanic rituals there, the main information in that article was compiled by a local person who'd been documenting and researching the issue for years. And he enabled that article to be published by sharing his information with the Sunday Express. So that is one indication of the powerful impact somebody can do if he has concern about this issue, if he can be bothered to actually research it, and also to campaign on it, because we need to lobby people about it. And there's safety in numbers. If people are nervous about it, form a group of like-minded people. But there are certain minimum standards you need to have. You need to, at minimum, mention SRA as SRA. Don't package it as something else. Don't package it as child sex abuse. Don't package it as pedophilia. Call it Satanist ritual abuse. Otherwise, people are never going to know what SRA is, or that SRA exists even in this country. And I'm going to draft some advice and guidelines for people who want to campaign and research on SRA, and I'm going to give it to you so that you can share it with anyone who contacts the UK Column office and would like some guidelines on campaigning and researching on SRA, and would like to maybe start a group in their own locality on this issue. And even if you can't find people to start a group, just an individual would find these guidelines helpful, I believe.
Right. And the other thing that you've pointed out is, of course, for many of the victims, to be able to simply talk to somebody who believes them is wonderful. It's a therapy. It's the start of them beginning to move out of the suffering that they've experienced. So if you are campaigning, it's quite likely somebody is going to approach you who has the knowledge. But you're saying be measured and take your time, presumably getting to know that person to see whether they're credible and whether the evidence is credible from them.
Yes, get as close to the evidence as possible. For example, the ideal is if you can interview the SRA survivor yourself. If not, then at least the mother or the father of the SRA survivor, whichever parent is keen to expose the SRA.
Yes.
It's also very important to get a copy of the medical examination, if there was one, of the victim, because physical evidence which shows sexual abuse is very important. Not surprising that in many SRA cases, the first thing that the people who are trying to obstruct an investigation go for is the medical examination report, because they want to suppress that. That is the smoking gun on abuse. And these are basic principles. And of course, I'll give more details to you on research and on campaigning, which people who want to campaign and research on SRA can do, because there are certain minimum standards we need to follow. If we don't mention SRA when we campaign, nobody's going to know about it. How do we expect the average person to know about SRA if we who know more about SRA than the average person do not identify it clearly and speak out about it? They'll never know about the subject, which is playing right into the hands of the Satanists. They don't want anybody to know about SRA.
Right. So we've got to an interesting point. The books are available. We've put those 3 books up as basically a beginning if people want to start reading where other people have done a lot of research and made comment. Those books are a good starting place. You are going to produce a guide in simple terms, which the UK column is happy to make available. And what we're really looking for is to see people starting to become active, to take on this very, very sinister threat to not only our children, but it's to our whole society. And I'm just going to bring on screen, this was a comment which Wilfred Wong made earlier, and I thought it was so powerful, which was stopping Satanism is war. We just can't walk away from it. It exists, and it's going to take us all working together to do something about it. So I'm going to say, Wilfred, thank you very much for joining us again. It's been extremely interesting. We are hoping very strongly that by starting to talk about it now, we're going to move away from just information in books to people becoming active and doing things. We're seeing great progress at the moment on child abuse, and you are saying it's time now to go to the next stage, which is to talk about satanic ritual abuse. And to do that, we've got to call it what it is.
Yes, and this is a golden opportunity, which I have not seen in the last 20 years. The government is feeling under pressure to act on child abuse, and that should include SRA if we make it an issue. But because not many people have spoken out about SRA or challenged the Home Secretary to involve SRA in her work, and in whatever action she's taking to deal with historical child abuse cases, this subject remains largely unseen. So we must challenge the Home Secretary and ask, what are you going to do in all your actions on historical child abuse cases to deal with SRA? Why haven't you spoken out about SRA? Why haven't you outlined action that you're going to take on SRA?
Right, and this is a very good point because, of course, I think I'm correct in saying SRA is not mentioned in the Goddard inquiry. So of all the things that they say they're going to investigate in Goddard, SRA is not one of them. And a final comment, we're just coming up to Halloween. What is the significance of Halloween?
I think Halloween is a very sad time, actually, a very tragic time for many SRA survivors. It brings back very deep traumatic memories for them because it is the major date on the Satanist calendar when they get together and commit their abuse for those who are Satanist ritual abusers. And so there are a lot of SRA survivors across the country for whom this is going to be a very sad time. It is not fun and games, trick and treat. It's a very different, darker reality that is associated with Halloween. And sadly, it's also a very active time for Satanist covens to get together and do their abuse for those who do SRA. Yeah. And so we need to really be aware of this, that this is the dark side underneath all the commercialization and the fun and games that people try and organize around Halloween. But it should also be an incentive to us to get on with it and do something practical to expose publicly SRA. Unless we publicly expose SRA by speaking about it publicly, by challenging those in authority to act on SRA, nothing is ever going to change.
Right. On that note, we'll end. I'm going to say, Wilfred, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, our audience today, for joining us. It's up to us. It's up to you. We've started the ball rolling. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.